Good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure to join you. So I'm the CEO of ISFC, which is the International Sustainable Finance Center, and I will be moderating this very exciting session on how to operationalize the S. And we will start with a very short presentation to tell you what exciting project we have been working on for the last year together with a range of partners. So let me share my screen and you'll be able to see it immediately. Just a moment, there we go. Voila, this is our very exciting project that we did together with Thomson Reuters Foundation, with ourselves, ISFC, with EcoAge, which is a private company that works in consulting on apparel and fashion. We have Refinitiv, that is now part of the London Stock Exchange. We have Mekong Club, an NGO working on supply chains and modern slavery in Asia. We have UNPRI, that we're a very valuable observing partner for this project. We have Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights that helped us out with some insights and were part of the consultation. And we had the Thomson Reuters Foundation that convened all of these partners to work together on a project to amplify and look deeper into what does S in the ESG mean. And then finally, we also had White & Case, one of the largest law firms in the world, which did very valuable work on mandatory due diligence. So what was this project all about? It was about demonstrating that it is actually possible and necessary to have more sophisticated social performance assessment when it comes to investment strategy and practice. And it was also to show that more indicators are available to measure the effects rather than just the efforts that then are routinely integrated into investment analysis today. Because throughout our project, by convening around 100 stakeholders, including investors, companies, civil society, NGOs, and experts, we found out that actually there's a lot of myths or misconceptions that exist in this space. A lot of them are actually based on real world challenges, proper issues that people are trying to tackle. But we do believe that a lot of it is also rooted in outdated data or outdated perceptions. So what do we mean by this? Our project actually looked at myths, realities, and actions. You will be able to see the full paper in mid to end April when we actually publish it. But we thought we'd give you a quick insight in terms of what were the myths, the realities, and the actions that we managed to identify throughout this year-long process. So myth number one was actually that social performance is less financially material than environmental performance. Time and again, we heard from investors saying that the E is really important in ESG. This is where the regulation is changing. This is really material for our returns. But we actually believe, and we found ample evidence, that social issues are key risks to all investors and their beneficiaries. It is a fast-changing landscape, as White & Case showed in their study, where they dug deep into what are the mandatory disclosure requirements and how they're changing, that actually these issues are becoming very salient, and eventually they will be very material. So how to tackle this? To actually avoid nasty or unpleasant risks, make sure that you diminish the risk and fulfill your fiduciary duty by looking at the S and taking it seriously. Myth number two, it is too difficult to know how and where to start assessing social performance. We heard that many times, saying that, it's a bit of an alphabet soup. Where do you start? Well, actually, in reality, we found out that the link between business and human rights is very well established, or at least it has become much more well established in the last decade. And you can use the existing resources to improve your understanding of social performance assessment so that you can navigate this maze of changing expectations. The other myths We found the myth that S indicators are too hard to measure. There is no reliable and comparable data. Again, that's linked to the alphabet soup or the complexity of it. However, we also found that it is actually possible and necessary to start using social indicators more, and that there are investors that have done so and are doing so very successfully. What to do about it? Identify the most useful indicators for you. Use and demand more data. It is actually up to investors to drive the data landscape as well, rather than be the rule takers and the takers of the data offered to them. You can try and influence the market and get better data. Myth number 4, qualitative surveys are the best method for analyzing social performance. We met plenty of investors that believe that qualitative surveys are by far the best way to go forward. Well, what we actually found when we dug deeper is that qualitative approaches can be really enriched by data-driven elements. It's not one or the other, it's actually a combination of both. And using a combination of data-driven input and qualitative analysis for due diligence and engagement is extremely valuable and can really set you apart from others. Then the final myth that we found was that a lot of people believe that integrating the S indicators is only relevant for impact investors because it's a niche theme, niche part of the investment landscape. Well, again, we found out that actually integrating the S indicators can help you identify more resilient and profitable investments. This is about competitive advantage. So doing the S better than others can actually be quite lucrative. So to benefit most from this, tailor your approach to social indicators to avoid miss risks and to avoid also missing out on opportunities that others might capitalize. So this is a very quick snapshot of our ESG Amplifying the S project that we did together with Thomson Reuters Foundation and our partners. I will stop sharing now and we will begin our panel. We have a fantastic speaker lineup here, and we will really be able to do a bit of a deep dive, digging deeper on the S. So first up, we have Clare Connellan from White & Case, who's going to share a very interesting outlook in terms of what's happening actually in the legal space. How is this thinking around the S changing? So Clare, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Linda, for the invitation to participate today. It's a real privilege to be with this panel. I try to set the scene by talking about 2 key drivers in operationalizing the S in ESG. I'm going to focus on legal drivers, but of course there are economic and political drivers as well. So the 2 key legal drivers that I'm going to talk about are transparency and liability. And there's a potential tension between transparency and liability. And a concern that's often voiced by business is that greater transparency can lead to exposure to greater liability. So first, transparency. The laws and regulations requiring reporting on ESG matters have become increasingly prevalent, and the pace of change is accelerating. And what we've seen is a hardening of soft law. The field started out with many voluntary initiatives, but there's now a general consensus from academic research, from NGO reports, and a number of studies, including commissioned by the European Union, that the voluntary approach is not enough. And more countries are introducing mandatory disclosure laws reporting on ESG, and in particular the S. So the study that Linda referred to, that White & Case carried out, was a review of ESG disclosure requirements for companies with a focus on social disclosure, on laws, regulations, government action, and stock exchange regulation in 45 countries across the Americas, EMEA, and Asia, as at February this year. And of the 234 laws and regulations that we surveyed, half of those were passed in just the last 5 years, and a quarter in just the last 2 years. And of all the 7 major financial centers we surveyed, all of them have issued new ESG disclosure requirements and there's been an increasing trend towards action by stock exchanges. So although overall there are fewer stock exchange measures compared to government actions, in the last 2 years, stock exchange actions than government action. And this can lead to a distinction in the disclosure requirements between public and privately held companies. So the required disclosures for public companies have been focusing on materiality for the business, but it means that companies can end up with different forms of disclosure. A government filing or report and a voluntary report could cover different topics based on the legal requirements as opposed to corporate priorities. A common trend in the disclosure laws and regulations is that they are requiring disclosure on a comply or explain basis, which means companies are either required to comply with the sustainability requirements or provide an explanation on why they're not in compliance with the requirements. So about 41% of the jurisdictions have a comply or explain approach. Another common requirement in the laws and regulations is a reference to a third-party standard. So about a third of the laws and regulations, including European Union measures, have adopted mandatory reporting or compliance regulatory requirements with a third-party standard as a reference. Now that might be the Global Reporting Initiative, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, OECD guidelines, International Integrated Reporting Council, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Not one particular approach has been adopted. And this highlights one of the other point, which is a lack of agreed terminology within the field. So sometimes even the term ESG and the S in ESG can be used interchangeably and without always clear definitions, which can make convergence of the legal standards more challenging. In the EU, there is an ambitious timeline for a new directive on reporting and due diligence requirements on mandatory human rights, environmental, and good governance due diligence that would require the due diligence to be carried out and reporting on that due diligence. The latest draft would show that it would apply to all companies operating in the EU, regardless of their place of operation and whether or not they are public or privately held. Now, so I've got a little bit of time left. I was going to go to the second key legal driver, which is liability. So the increased scrutiny on the ESG efforts has a corollary in disputes, where claimants are invoking novel theories and strategies to try and impose greater accountability on corporations. The trend is towards breaking down the traditional concepts of jurisdiction, of corporate separateness, and tort liability. And claimants are using disclosure sometimes to support their claims of accountability. So one brief example, in the UK Supreme Court, just in the last couple of weeks, has delivered a judgment that concludes that it's at least arguable, based on a degree of control or de facto management, that a parent company can owe a duty of care to claimants in respect of alleged environmental damage and human rights abuses for an overseas subsidiary. But even when these novel legal theories don't succeed, the willingness of the courts to consider them can present a risk in itself. And prevention is always the best way to mitigate risk. So I expect to see more active governance, increased due diligence, and considered reporting and transparency with an increased focus on social as well as environmental factors. Thanks, Linda.
Claire, that was fantastic. It's a fantastic snapshot of how the legal risk is changing in this particular case. And I think for investors and companies, this is a very important development. Which brings us actually to our next speaker, Elena Espinosa from the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, who heads their social work. She's the head of social issues. So Elena will share some insights from UNPRI, which is the largest network of signatories, investor signatories, to UNPRI. So please, Elena.
Yes, thank you so much, Linda. Yeah, very honored to be speaking at this panel and speaking about social issues, of course, which is what I look after within the PRI. And for those who don't know us, yes, as Linda mentioned, we are a network of institutional investors, and we have more than 3,600 signatories so far that represent more than $100 trillion of asset under management. So quite a big network. And a very global network. And what we do is just support these investors in the integration of ESG factors into investment and ownership decisions. And yes, as Clarice mentioned, I mean, one of the drivers for our work in social issues has been the changes in legislation and the increase in legislation that we've seen around social issues. a trend that we see getting bigger. We're not going to see less of legislation. We're going to see more, but not just more in a disorganized ways. We're also seeing a convergence of this legislation to make sense of how both companies and investors look at social issues and how they identify positive and negative outcomes and how do they manage these outcomes as well. And we think that this is really important for the investment sector, because we think that for the financial system to serve its intended purpose, people need to be at the heart of how investments are conducted. And this is important to retain social license to operate, but also to avoid risk both to people and portfolios. And on the upside, it has the potential to deliver social progress and a transformational contribution towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So it has both benefits, but it's also a way for investors to mitigate risk. And we also think that, the lack of development in the S of ESG sometimes has to do with the fact that, yes, it requires a different analytical perspective and the quasi-qualitative way of looking at social indicators. So it can be sometimes at odds in the way that finance is quite quantitative in the way that is measured. But having said that, we don't think we think it's crucial for investors to think about these issues and to integrate them in the way that they do investments. And it also it's just a matter of trying to accommodate and understand a different way of thinking about issues and how to measure their impact, but not to think that it is impossible to do so. We do believe this is very possible, and we welcome the work of the group in terms of the myth around the S of ESG, because it does takes those misconceptions and actually turn them around and explain to investors how to understand the myth, but also how to take action in overcoming. So that's been great. And in the case of the work that the PRI is doing, obviously our work is very much based on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is what we consider the international standard by excellence. I mean, because it's been ratified by the UN Human Rights Council, and this was done unanimously. So it's the one international standard that is most accepted in most countries. But it also explains that the responsibility, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights exists, and it applies not just to private sector, but also investors, and that this is independent to the state duty to protect human rights. So it clearly defines that the private sector, including investors, need to respect human rights, and this is not just a role of states, but they have also a role to play. And in that, we now been trying to translate the UN Guiding Principles into what does that mean for investors, and just looking at the three pillars. And also in the three ways that investors can implement them, and just give examples of how they should consider not only having a policy around human rights management that should be embedded in everything they do, but when they do due diligence process, to think about investments and social issues in investment pre, during, and post. So understanding how does that work, and the role that they can play in engaging companies and all investees, and just developing those relationships and building leverage to influence behavior of companies. So not only on reporting, but also on the management of these outcomes, but also on the third, the framework, which is the access to remedy. Because in most cases, because investors are one step further from where the outcomes happen, it's difficult to understand who has responsibility for the remedy of negative outcomes. But when investors are not directly linked, they should make sure that they are using their leverage to make sure that the investee companies that do have responsibility then offer remedy to those people, to the people affected. And in that, like we'll see, and that's one of the discussions that is happening right now in the EU in terms of liability as well, which affect investors going forward. When we see negative outcomes in terms of social issues. So in general, just to finish with my introduction in terms of what we plan to do and what are our next steps, it's around, well, I mean, we will support investors in implementing the UN Guiding Principles. We hopefully will try to strengthen accountability within the investment sector by including human rights as part of our reporting framework, which is a requirement for all signatories is to do every year. And indicators around human rights at the beginning will be introduced on a voluntary basis. Eventually they will become mandatory, and hopefully as well there will be minimum requirements for investors when it comes to human rights. And we would also help them with the collaboration in engaging different companies in different sectors as well, and also try to develop policy positions, so helping investors in understanding the ways that they can support, engage, or even be proactive with governments in different countries around the S of ESG. Yes, so we'll wait for questions.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. I think that's very complementary to Claire's point about the direction of travel, that what used to be and is still voluntary might actually eventually become mandatory. So it is always better to be prepared and to know and understand the subject matter very well. But also for that, actually, and this has been one of the big complaints we've heard from the investors, is complaints about data, complaints about ratings and standards. So actually, with us, we have a great expert who can talk about the variety of data issues and other problems that we see in this space, which gives rise to that notion of an alphabet soup, which is very, very difficult to navigate. How do you get the data? So we will definitely get to that in a minute, because I think we're having a small technical glitch. So before we get David back, we also have two very prominent US investors here who can actually talk about how do you do this in practice, which of course is of great interest to all of us, because these are the people really fighting the good fight on the ground. So we'll start with Tamara Sells. She's the Associate Investment Manager at Calpers, and Calpers is a big player in this space and has done quite a lot of interesting things. So please, Tamara, can we hear from you?
Yes, thank you so much. And I apologize if we have some connectivity issues. I am having some technical glitches on my side as well.
We hear you loud and clear.
Fantastic. That's great. I want to say good afternoon and thank you to the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization staff, and a special thanks to the panelists. It's certainly a pleasure to be here today. I just like to start off by highlighting that the convergence of this current economic, climate, and public health crisis, as well as the mounting call to advance racial equity, have accelerated investors' focus on effectively managing human capital, and we at Calpers share this focus. We're the largest public pension fund in the United States, managing approximately $450 billion in global assets, with equity holdings in over 10,000 public companies globally. We're fiduciary to over 2 million members, providing approximately $25 billion annually in retirement benefits. Approximately 55 cents of every dollar that we provide in retirement benefits comes from, which means our members and our beneficiaries depend on the safety and the soundness of capital markets for their retirement security. And it's for these reasons that we are intensely focused on a number of sustainability issues that drive risk and return to our portfolio. So when we talk about operationalizing and integrating the S of ESG, that's back when we adopted a set of 10 investment beliefs in 2013, which recognize that long-term sustainable value creation relies upon the effective management of three forms of capital: financial, physical, and human. This puts people at the heart of our investment agenda. And it also gives the S of the ESG an integrated role as we are guided by these investment beliefs. Furthermore, we are guided by our governance sustainability principles, which make clear that we expect fair, accurate, timely as to how companies are employing the financial, physical, and human capital to both generate sustainable returns, as well as how they identify, monitor, and mitigate risk to those three forms of capital. In 2016, our Calpers board approved a 5-year sustainable investment strategy, which covers our approach to climate change, human capital, and other sustainability factors. Our strategy is structured through 3 channels: advocacy, engagement, and integration, which are supported through partnerships. So we advocate for progressive human capital practices and disclosures with regulators and standard setters on a variety of human capital topics, from worker health and safety, labor rights, diversity, equity, inclusion, for example. We co-founded the Human Capital Management Coalition in the wake of the Rana Plaza tragedy of Bangladesh. And we wanted to provide a platform essentially for research, knowledge sharing, collaboration on our company engagements and our regulatory. Representing several trillion in assets, the Human Capital Management Coalition has been more recently focused on the human capital data and the lack of standardized reporting through the development of a rulemaking petition to the SEC, where we ask that the Commission issue very clear guidance to implement metrics around human capital disclosure requirements. Also, through our participation on the SEC Investor Advisory Committee, we urge the SEC to undertake a robust examination that the role human capital plays in value creation, as well as provided recommendations on improving the corporate disclosure system to include specific disclosures regarding intangible assets, including human capital. We engage companies and our managers to further the development and adoption of human and disclosures. So since 2017, we've engaged about 800 US companies, of which 518 have added at least one diverse director. And on the integration front, we integrate human capital management across our portfolio, public and markets, to better identify, measure, and assess our long-term risk and opportunity at a total fund level. So we assess diversity across our external managers through a D&I survey. And in order to address sustainability issues in private markets, we've adopted a responsible contractor policy for human capital, which requires our external managers to provide an annual detailed account of our workforce conditions with respect to our real assets and our infrastructure investments. And then in private equity, we use the Institutional Limited Partners Association, also known as ILPA template, for including ESG and diversity in our manager due diligence. And just the last point here is that research is the core pillar of our sustainable investment strategy. So we have a request for information, which seeks to identify providers that can source and evaluate a new round of research and analysis specific to human capital that will be a part of our third phase of our sustainable investment, also known as Series 3. And this curated, peer-reviewed research will help inform our strategy and ensure Calpers' investment in evidence-based and economic insights.
Perfect. Thank you, Tamara. I think that's a fantastic overview of what Calpers is doing. And it's very interesting also to note that Calpers is actively joining these multi-stakeholder initiatives and trying to drive the agenda, because that is one of the most powerful things that we actually discovered investors can do, is working through UNPRI with Elena, trying to figure out, what these indicators should be, how do we look at them, working with big law firms and trying to understand the landscape, such as White & Case, trying to see how this space is changing and what to watch out for and to be prepared, as I said before, rather than being caught out, to also have these red flags and know where there might be issues. And one of the most interesting things that we found out throughout the project is how much we actually need to look at supply chains. So this is not the topic of this particular panel, but this is something very important that will be growing in importance also going forward, because most of the risks, around 40 to 50%, hide in supply chains. But before we go on, we've got David back. So welcome back. We're very excited to see you, which is great. So as I mentioned, David is actually from the London Stock Exchange Group. He is here as the group head of sustainable business, and he will tell us interesting things about the data landscape and about what they have been working on and their experiences with the S. There we go, David, please. And then we're going to head to Reka. So we're happy to see you back as well.
Thanks, Linda. Sorry about that. My computer died on me. I hope it doesn't happen again. I was going to touch on a few of the things. Actually, I think some of the points which Claire mentioned, obviously relevant when talking about exchanges. So I thought maybe I could provide a few kind of context points, and then there's a particular few points I wanted to make. So, I mean, firstly, in terms of context, we're kind of a range of different data or financial infrastructure and data businesses. So we've got the London Stock Exchange, which forms part of our capital markets business. We've got the Refinitiv is now part of the business alongside FTSE Russell, which sits within our data and analytics business. We've also got our post-trade. So many of these issues around actually ESG and social data is really relevant across the different parties that we work with. And we've got quite a role, and I'd say a responsibility to help try and join this up. So one of the things which I should say is that the quality of the data, the analytics, the benchmarks that we provide investors with is directly proportional to the quality of data. Also, as an exchange, we've also got a vested interest to make sure that we get this right for issuers. And so one thing we've been advocating for is very much kind of globally consistent data. There's a lot of moves going on at the moment which are going to help drive that. That's happening, I guess, at a regulatory level. With IOSCO and IFRS stepping into the fray is really important, something we've been keen to see for a long time. Also, exchanges can work together, and we've been collaborating with other exchanges through the UN Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative to help try and drive better and more consistent global data. So been doing that on ESG reporting. There's a specific piece around climate at the moment on that. But I want to make kind of 5 quick points in relation to social data. The first is that investor demand for this type of data is running well ahead of where social data is today. There's a lot of large institutional investors, and obviously Eleanor from PRI has been talking about the size and scale of their membership. Many large institutional investors are wanting to integrate this across all assets. That includes across their index investments, and obviously Tamara and Rekha can speak well to that. And there is a lot of challenges in trying to do it. So the desire is there. Many are. There's a Dutch fund detail handle. We've been working with them across all of their index investing to bring the Sustainable Development Goals, 4 particular SDGs, which are decent work, which is DG 8, 12, which is responsible production and consumption, 13, climate action, and 14, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions, using different types of ESG data, including a lot of the S data, to re-weight companies in those indexes, overweighting companies which are better positioned on those SDGs and underweighting companies which are less well positioned. So it is already being used at scale, and we're only going to see a lot more of that. So first point was that one. Second point is that reported sustainability data has actually improved dramatically over the last 20 years. When I joined FTSE 20 years ago, just after we launched FTSE for Good, ESG data was pretty simplistic. There's very little of it. Today, it's come a long way, including on the social side, but it's not where it needs to be. It's still got to come a lot further. And although with some areas we're getting better data, in many social areas it's still pretty challenging. Just in terms of trying to get, some of the legal challenges around diversity data. In some countries, it's not legal to actually disclose this kind of information. So some quite kind of gritty challenges there. My third point I wanted to make was that there is massive interconnection between different themes. So we like dividing things up, ESG, but actually, climate is a massive social issue. These issues are deeply interconnected, and so sometimes these are slightly kind of false divisions that we create between them. My fourth point was that there's new, alternative, unstructured, not necessarily corporate reported data is a big area of development, and there's a lot of exciting work going on there. Which many of these points obviously also brought up very articulately in the myths that are being busted in it and are brought up there. But there's all sorts of there's the information that corporate reports to the world. There's also all the information that everybody else says about the corporates. And actually, there's a lot of very interesting data that can be mined there and can be used, including on social metrics. So fifth and final point: there is no excuse for inaction. Actually, the data is going to continue to evolve. It will continue to improve, but actually, there's a lot there to get going with, and investors need to be taking action on it. Corporates need to be aware that they're going to be judged increasingly on these measures.
David. That's a fantastic call to action. That's exactly what we also are calling for. There is no longer good excuses for inaction. But on that note, Reka Weitler, who has joined us from the Illinois State Treasurer's Office, we are really excited to have you here because we would love to hear actually what the Illinois State Treasurer's Office is doing on the S, because I believe that you're one of the thought leaders in this space along with Calpers. Reka is the Deputy Director of Corporate Governance and Sustainable Investments. So please.
Thank you. So yeah, ever since I came into this office in 2018, I've seen the Treasurer's Office do so many things, and it's great because we keep busy. But ever since the Treasurer came into office in 2014, it's been a priority of his to have the diversity of our state reflected and the diversity of our financial partners. So when I began my work here, I was focused on our diversity, equity, and inclusion program, seeking to increase diversity and provide support to diverse firms within our network of financial partners. But from there, we've done a lot of work on diversity, and I point to diversity because it's definitely one of the diversity and inclusion is one of the S indicators that has gotten a lot of attention this year, particularly, and continues to be important. And so in terms of our office, we do a lot of corporate engagement work on diversity issues, but our other social issues that we prioritize include opioid epidemic, which leads to maybe health and safety, as well as human capital management being a large portion of our work as well. This year we've engaged over 3,700 companies on materially important sustainability issues, a large portion of that being on diversity through our Russell 3000 Board Diversity Disclosure Initiative, in which we've joined with investors representing about $7 trillion in assets under management to amplify market attention on race, ethnicity, and gender of corporate board members. And we've sought a greater disclosure by companies within the Russell 3000 on gender, race, and ethnicity of board members. And the data is on gender is reported pretty well, but we have seen that the data on race and ethnicity is not reported in a robust manner. And so that's something that we push for. And so, just echoing everyone else's comments, disclosure has always, and transparency has been a core part of how we operationalize the S in ESG. Beyond that major initiative of ours in which we've contacted all Russell 3000 companies, we also participate in other engagements around some of our portfolio companies and how they're managing human capital in the wake of COVID-19. And those have been very insightful because we've really seen how companies who have prioritized management prior to this pandemic have shown resilience, whereas companies that have been laggards have struggled during this time. And so engagement work is something that has always been a big focus of our investment stewardship work and continues to take our focus, especially on the S side of things, because as David mentioned, it doesn't exist in a silo. Environmental justice issues are tied into this as well, and so it's something that we pay a lot of attention to. We also do this work through our proxy voting. We've adjusted our policy this year to essentially vote against the nominating governance committees of companies that do not disclose on their racial and ethnic diversity of the board. We believe the disclosure is the bare minimum that a company can be doing on an area of material concern to our office. And so we have implemented that policy. Other investors have done that too. So we definitely see consensus in terms of this is not just us asking for this. This is something that a lot of investors are asking for. We're not alone in this. Beyond that, we definitely have, we include sustainability factors in a lot of other ways as well. So in terms of our due diligence, we ask of all of our asset managers to explain to us how they are including sustainability factors into their decision making and into all of their processes. And so that's something that we have done for many years now, and we continue to do that. And it's been very eye-opening for us in understanding how our asset managers are approaching this, in addition to our portfolio companies, and then beyond that, we also have, we also tie this into our fixed income engagements. So we develop a sustainability investment profile for all of our debt issuers and assess them on sustainability, which includes human capital and diversity metrics. And it all ties into, our office has always thought that sustainability should not be treated as something that is separate from other financial factors. And so we have always integrated it into our own processes and how we perform our investment decision making. But we also pushed for, in Illinois in 2020, January 1st, a law was signed, the Sustainable Investment Act, which requires that all entities in the state of Illinois who manage or hold public funds incorporate sustainability factors into their investments, investment decision-making processes. And so we've definitely worked to make this a standard across the board. And we've definitely collaborated with other investors who've sought to do this kind of work, integrate the S into their processes, and we hope to continue to do so.
Thank you so much, Reka. That's fantastic. I do agree with David and you that in general, these are interlinked issues, right? So the S affects the E affects the S, and the G affects everything, because governance is extremely important as well. I would like to thank all of our panelists. We did have one question from the audience asking what next? What should investors be actively doing? And I'm not sure we have enough time to tackle that, but that's something that maybe should remain as a big question to tackle during the rest of the sessions and maybe during the networking parts. Maybe let's see this as an inspiration. Like, we all know what the problems are. At least most of us do. We know that inequality is one of the wicked evils of our time. So is climate change. So what more should we do? And especially on the social side, because the social side will be crucial, not leaving people behind and making sure that our political and economic systems are resilient. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you for our excellent speakers with very, complementary points and complementary views. And thank you for the RFK team for putting together such a great event. Thank you, everybody. And let's continue the discussion in other forums. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda.
Thanks, Linda.